In the history of rock and roll, there are many examples of bands that are referred to as a supergroup. Now, what this usually means is that the individual members of the band had already had successes in previous ventures, bands or solo artists or whatever, and now they form together to form a new group, which becomes a supergroup. And there are quite a few examples of this. Of course, there's the cream. You have Eric Clapton from the Yardbirds, Ginger Baker from the Graham Bond Organization, and Jack Bruce from the Graham Bond Organization, and Manfred Mann. Now, after the cream breaks up, Clapton goes and jams with Stevie Winwood of Traffic, and they form a new group called Blind Faith that includes not only Clapton and Winwood, but Ginger Baker on drums and Rick Grush of Family playing bass. Another supergroup, of course, is Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, where you get Stills and Young from Buffalo Springfield, Crosby from the Byrds, and Nash from the Hollies. Another supergroup, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Emerson from the Nice, Greg Lake from King Crimson, and Carl Palmer from the Crazy World of Arthur Brown. Eric Clapton is in another supergroup. This is Derek and the Dominoes. So we have Clapton, then we have Bobby Whitlock, Carl Radle, and Jim Gordon, all from Delaney and Bonnie, and Duane Allman from the Allman Brothers Band. When the Eagles formed, you had Don Henley and Glenn Frey from Lyndon Ronstadt's backing band. Bernie Leadon came from the Flying Burrito Brothers, and Randy Meisner was from Poco. And then on the country side, you also had a supergroup called the Highwaymen: Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Chris Christopherson. But of all the talent we've talked about in those supergroups, there is one supergroup that this episode is about that I think far outshines any of those other groups for its sheer talent, its humor, and the band was made up of fictitious half-brothers, but the world knows them as the Traveling Wilburys. And of course, they are Roy Orbison, who we talked about in the last episode, George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty, and Bob Dylan. Wow, what a group. And what an amazing 2 albums that they put out. So, as we've said before, are you ready to go to the end of the line? Let's go meet the Traveling Wilburys. Let's drop the needle. The formation of the Traveling Wilburys didn't really have a grand plan. It just kind of happened. You see, George Harrison needed a B-side to a single that was about to come out, and he had just finished an album called Cloud 9, which was produced by Jeff Lynne. And he got on really well with Jeff. So he thought maybe Jeff could help him with this B-side single that he was going to have to create. But Jeff was a very busy man. At the same time, he was producing Roy Orbison's solo album and also Tom Petty's Full Moon Fever. Well, you can kind of see what's going to happen. George has dinner with Jeff and Roy Orbison and convinces them to come by and help him make this B-side to the single. But they had a couple of problems. First, most of the studios in LA were booked. So where are they going to get space to record quickly? Well, it turns out that their friend, Bob Dylan, had a makeshift studio at his home in Malibu. So they called up Dylan and said, "Can we come out tomorrow and record?" And Dylan says yes. So then on the day that this is going to happen, George realizes that, the guitar he wants to use, he lent to Tom Petty. So he goes to Tom's house to pick up the guitar. And of course, while he's there, he says, "Tom, we're all going out to Bob's studio to record a B-side for the single I'm making. Would you like to come along?" And of course, without hesitation, Petty said sure. George had written a song and he presented it to his 4 friends, and they recorded it rather quickly. And it was called Handle with Care. So they presented it to the record company and said, "Here you go, here's our B-side." And the record company listened to it and said, "This is terrific. But we don't want to put this out as the B-side of a single. We think you guys ought to go make an album." So now, if they're going to make an album, they need to have a name for the band. Now, when George and Jeff were recording Cloud 9, they came up with a phrase. And the phrase was, anytime they'd make a mistake in the recording, they say, "We'll bury it in the mix." Well, that "we'll bury it" quickly turned into Wilburys. And then they came up with the idea of the Traveling Wilburys. Once they started recording, they ran into a stumbling block because they needed to get permission from each of the existing artists' labels to let them record on the new label the Wilburys was going to come out on. Well, there wasn't a problem, of course, with George, and there wasn't a problem with Lynne, and there wasn't a problem with Roy Orbison, and there wasn't a problem with Tom Petty. But apparently there was a problem with Columbia letting Bob Dylan partake. And so they reached a compromise where they decided they would create fictitious personas for each member of the group. So they decided that all of the fake Wilbury names would be half-brothers. George became Nelson Wilbury. Jeff Lynne became Otis Wilbury. Roy Orbison was Lefty Wilbury. Tom Petty was Charles T. Wilbury Jr., and Bob Dylan became Lucky Wilbury. So George wanted to take this even further. So the album was released on a new label, which was christened Wilbury Records. The five of them worked well together, and they really enjoyed each other's company. And they would often sit around with guitars around a table and come up with song ideas and toss lyrics out back and forth to each other. And it seemed like the weirder that they were, the more that they enjoyed them. Now, the songs are all credited to the band, but when you listen to a song, you can usually tell who did the majority of the writing of the song, because usually that is the person who sings lead. Now, a few years after the Wilburys had ceased to exist, a box set came out called Collections, and if you look at that, it kind of lists who wrote the songs in a lot more detail. Harrison is credited for the singles Handle with Care and End of the Line, as well as Heading for the Light. There's a story that Tom Petty tells that they were all at a barbecue at Petty's house with everyone shouting out lyrics, and the ones that George liked stayed in. Petty goes on to say that the smell of food cooking prompted him to yell out the lyric, "Oh, the sweet smell of success," which of course made it onto the song. Dylan is credited with Dirty World, where all the other members fill in the line, "He loves your dirty blank." And you can tell Dylan also wrote Tweeter and the Monkey Man and Congratulations. Tom Petty wrote Last Night and Margarita. And Jeff Lynne is the main writer of Rattled and Not Alone Anymore. Although on Not Alone Anymore, Roy Orbison just really shines. They label the album Traveling Wilburys #1, and it's a smash hit, reaching #3 in the US and staying on the charts for 50 weeks. However, just 2 months after the release of the album, Roy Orbison tragically dies. Now, they wanted to release End of the Line as a single, and they wanted to make a music video for it. So they did, but of course, Roy Orbison was no longer with them. So in the video, you can actually see that they have a rocking chair rocking with a guitar in it, and they focus on that when Roy is singing on the track. It's a very nice touch, and you can find it on the Wilburys website or on YouTube. Bob Dylan and Tom Petty went on to their solo careers, and George Harrison would wax and wane whether he was hot to the idea of reforming the Wilburys or not. But he ended up that he was, and they did regroup in 1990. This next album, when it was released, took the joke a little bit further, and it's labeled Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. Of course, there is no Volume 2. And they decided to change their Wilbury names again. For this record, George was no longer Nelson. He now became Spike. Jeff Lynne was no longer Otis, but now Clayton Wilbury. Tom Petty was no longer Charlie T. Wilbury Jr., but now Muddy Wilbury. And Bob Dylan gave up the name Lucky to become Boo Wilbury. But one name stayed the same. The album is dedicated to Lefty Wilbury, which of course was the name that Roy Orbison had taken. Now on this album, Dylan is more prominent than he was on the first album. And the reason for this is as they were recording it, he was about to go out on tour. And so he recorded a lot of the lead vocals so that they would have them, which meant that then George and Jeff Lynne had the really tough assignment of trying to decide which songs they would take Bob's voice off of the lead? That had to be tough. The tracks are She's My Baby, with all of them on lead vocals. Inside Out, which features Bob, then George on the bridge, and Tom on the chorus. If You Belong to Me, Bob on lead. The Devil's Been Busy, all of them sing lead, Bob on the bridge. Seven Deadly Sins, that's Bob. Poor House, Jeff and Tom. Where Were You Last Night? Bob on lead, George on the bridge. Cool Dry Place, that's Tom. New Blue Moon is all of them. You Took My Breath Away, Tom with Jeff on the bridge. And Wilbury Twist, everyone. The album was a success, but not as big as the first one. Now remember, George was one of the Beatles who decided he was fed up with touring all those years ago. But now he starts playing with the idea that the Wilburys should go on tour. He even joked that they could all sing Blowing in the Wind and then introduce Bob, and Bob could come out and sing something. But sadly, that never happened. As usual, I've created a Spotify playlist. Here's the link. I'll also put it in the comments, and you can listen to the music of the Traveling Wilburys and have a great time, because it is a lot of fun. If you want to know more about the Traveling Wilburys, go to their website. Lots of information on that. And I also recommend a book. It's called The Traveling Wilburys, a biography by Nick Thomas. It's fun to read. So as I said at the beginning, there have been lots of supergroups. But one of my favorites, probably my all-time favorite, was made up of fictitious half-brothers. I love the Traveling Wilburys. If you want to see my previous episodes that talk about the careers of most of the Wilburys, here are those episodes. We'll start with George. That would be episode 24. George Harrison, Behind That Locked Door. Jeff Lynne would be episode 27. Do Ya? Then episode 80 would be Bob Dylan. There's Blood on Those Tracks, my top 10 Dylan albums. And last week's episode 169 on Roy Orbison, Only the Lonely. Yeah, I haven't yet had time to do one for Tom Petty. So that'll happen in the future. But like all good things, we are now approaching the end of the line. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.